All right, everyone, welcome back. Chiefs in training, and others interested in CPO leadership and management topics of discussion. I'm retired Fleet Master Chief Paul Kingsbury and author of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide, the second edition. That's out on the street now. And today we're going to discuss episode 4 in your CPO Guide video series, which is going to cover chapter 3, the history and use of CPO positional power. So before we get into that, I wanted to review what we've discussed so far. So episode 1 was an introduction to the Chief Petty Officer's Guide. It covered my intent, the background of writing it, and basically a how-to to how to use the guide and what makes it different from the first edition that you may or may not have. The second episode we went in, we covered chapter 1, which was the expectations of being the Chief Petty Officer, which I also would like to call Welcome to the Mess. So in that, I briefly discovered or discussed the values, beliefs, attitudes, and focus of Chief Petty Officers and what that chapter identifies in those. And then finally, the last series, episode 3, started to introduce you into the Chief Petty Officer power and influence model. So if you haven't seen those to date, I encourage you to come back and take a look at those, because each series in this is going to build upon the next and refer back to prior episodes that we've done. So once again, before we get started, hit that subscribe button down there on the YouTube channel, like it, give me a thumbs up, and then share it. And frankly, as we do these, use these videos when you can. I know we're distributed worldwide as a Navy Chiefs Mess, but use these videos to complement your training along with the Chief Petty Officer's Guide. That's why it was written. It's not an absolute, but it's definitely a tool to complement our leadership development continuum and framework that you've got out there, because I think you can agree just the leadership development courses alone are not enough to give you what you need. So you need to talk more, you need to read more, you need to learn new tactics and strategies as a leader and manager, and then you go out and practice them. So that's the intent of this. So take these videos, take the content of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide, and go into the Chiefs Mess and have discussions and learn. So, all right, so let's get on to it. So this chapter, referring back to your Chief Petty Officer Power and Influence model, if you go to page 26 of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide, we're going to start with the first power base, which is your positional power. And this is also known as legitimate power, and I'm going to discuss a little bit more about that when we get into the concept of authorities. So this chapter is really divided into two main parts, as the title references. So there's the history of the the history and evolution of Chief Positional Power. And I go back from 1893, when we established the rate of Chief Petty Officer, and I talk through, all the major evolutionary steps, not super in depth, but a little bit, and touching on them because I want you to understand. You should understand how we evolved to get to where we were. So I covered down 1893. I reference Warrant Officer Lester Tucker's piece on the history of the grade of the Chief Petty Officer. All those reads are out there already. You can get to all the primary source material that's out there if you're, if you're well read into the history of a Chief Petty Officer. And then I work through the evolution of the Super Chiefs, right? So we get into 1958 when we established the pay grades of E8 and E9. So for us, it would be the Senior Chief and Master Chief Petty Officer. And then I take it forward to where we evolved the Command Master Chief, Senior Enlisted program. I talk a little bit about, how we struggled over time to, kind of gain ground and establish the responsibilities and authorities that would come with those new pay grades. So that's the first section of it, a little reach back into our history and heritage. But like I said, I reference other readings because I didn't want the guide to just reproduce content that's already out there. So I reference Charlotte Christ's Winds of Change, which talks about the history and evolution of the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy's office. So if you have never read or heard of that, that's a good read. I know it doesn't catch us up to modern times and the more recent Master Chief Petty Officers of the Navy, but it does a great job of talking about the establishment of that office, the history of it, and the significance of that office and what each successive MCPON did to establish it, and then frankly introduce policies that came in and really professionalized and educated the enlisted force and and was a significant reason of why we're here and what we do today. So that's the first section first part of chapter 3. And the second part really gets into the use of CPO positional power. So as I mentioned in other videos, in the spring, the Petty Officer's Guide is going to come out. So I took this chapter, definitely enrolled it into there. But one thing I didn't put into this, I really didn't break into, when you look at CPO position power or your legitimate power, the thing I give when I talk briefs to people is I talk about, the model of the RAA, right? RAA model, responsibility, authority, and accountability. And, I kind of made an assumption as chief petty officers, we've got that model nailed and kind of we got it down. But I think it goes without saying it's always good to review that. So I didn't write in our chief petty officers guide on the Navy side, at least, about the RAA model. But I definitely built up a huge section in the petty officers guide because I wanted to talk about responsibility, authority, and accountability, and really pause and think about those things that you may take for granted. I know they were introduced to you in your petty officer leadership courses, at least for me when I went to petty officer NDOC as a third class. And back then our eyes probably glazed over. You're like, yeah, responsibility, authority, accountability, the words that we throw around often. But I think it's important now to really pause and think about those. So let's talk through those really quickly. So with positional power, you get several things that come with that power base. So first thing you get is you get access to an audience of influence targets, like we talked about in chapter 2, right? You're going to get the ability, legitimate power to be able to give orders, to fulfill responsibilities that are given to you in your new position, okay? You've often heard you were selected not because of your ability to do that job, because of your potential, but you were selected into a new position of responsibility and authority based on your demonstrated use, I would say, of power and influence you to meet objectives and responsibilities that you have in prior positions. And you did that in a way that not only accomplished the mission of warfighting readiness, ensured your piece of warfighting readiness was met, but you also did that in a way that shaped a positive and favorable divisional or watch team or work center climate, right? What have you. So it's not just that you got things done, right? Because you can get things done and then kind of leave climate and workforce morale in the gutter if you don't do it in the right way. But you were able to accomplish your mission and do it in a way that at least got your people compliant, if not up to levels of commitment that you need to do. So because of that, the organization recognizes that. We write your evaluations and you're selected via our processes, either with profile sheet or with a selection board, to become a chief petty officer. And now we're saying, hey, take those fundamentals that you've used, all the success you've used using power and influence and management skills. Now we're going to give you a new audience to target through, and we're going to allow you to have responsibility on a broader swath of the organization, okay? So you start to actually step away from the deck plate as you get promoted up, and I'll mention that, and I'll continue to mention it as we go, into further lessons in this video series. So, a couple things we give you. So, number one, you're put in this new position of power, right, as a chief petty officer. So you're going to have responsibilities, okay? And there's several different types of them. So you've got general responsibilities that are covered that you've always had as a petty officer, frankly. So we introduced you to these in Navy regulations, the Milpers manual. There's general regulations that you have to give orders, to have them complied with, to enforce standards, and to have your orders followed, right? So if you haven't gone back and looked at your general responsibilities in Navy regulations, this is a good time to go back and do that. Go back and look at those. And I'm going to get into a little discussion here about, when we talk about, oh, my power's been taken away, I'm going to kind of myth bust that a bit because it's not true. So the first thing in your positional power is understanding the scope of your responsibilities, right? What are you responsible to accomplish? So number one, the Navy gives you general responsibilities as a petty officer, as a chief petty officer, to accomplish and, frankly, do the things you need to establish and maintain good order and discipline. The next thing you have is specific responsibilities, okay? These are going to be the ones that are associated with your position. So if you're a divisional chief, a platoon leader, what have you, there are specific responsibilities and they should be written down somewhere, right? So they should be written down in your SORM or whatever directive covers organizational responsibilities. They should be there. Many people get into positions of new positions of responsibility and authority. I don't think we take time to review those. So go back and review those and understand what you're supposed to be getting done day to day. You can be doing this in a primary billet, but you can also be doing this in a collateral duty as well. So if you're running a collateral duty, whatever that is, those have some pretty significant responsibilities in some cases. Make sure you know the governing document that governs those responsibilities and that you're referencing and you've read the responsibilities and you understand the relationships between you, the people you work for, and the people that work for you in executing those things. Okay, so general, specific, and then I'll cover a third one, which is there are some responsibilities that go with being a chief petty officer, and these are loosely defined in the Chief Petty Officer's Creed. So you got to, read over that and really understand. And you got to be cautious about it, because the Chief Petty Officer Creed talks about, we have responsibilities that necessarily haven't been covered in writing. That may or may not be true, but you got to understand the boundaries of your responsibilities. I'm going to get into authorities in a little bit. So you got your general, your specific, and the ones that are covered a little bit in the Chief Petty Officer's Creed. Okay, so go back, read over your responsibilities and understand them, and then reflect on, are you even meeting those, and how do you know you're meeting those responsibilities? So in order to fulfill those responsibilities, the next thing we give you is the first A, right? Authority. And really what authority gives you is, it's not just legitimacy, right? That's why we call this power-based legitimate power. But it legitimizes you, right? And gives you power to fulfill those responsibilities. But it also gives you decision-making power. And it gives you access to these new influence targets, okay? So as a Chief Petty Officer, your influence targets have changed. When you make Senior Chief, your influence target's going to change. We're going to elevate you, and we're going to, expect you to, exert authority and have responsibilities all over different. And to get those done, you're going to influence different people. So your authority is going to cover, or going to give you that power to execute your responsibilities. And to do that, we're going to get into a couple things. So I didn't discuss in the Chief's Guide, but we're going to talk about your decision-making power. Actually, it is covered, but it's covered in the management section that we'll talk later. But it also gets into giving orders. Okay, and I know giving orders sounds pretty fundamental, but it goes with military service, right? In many cases, you want to be able to explain why you're doing and what you're not doing, but there's going to be cases when you just need to use your authorities to get things done, and they can't be questioned. So this authority is backed up, okay, by several things. It's backed up by your written responsibilities. It's backed up by support of the wardroom. And frankly, it's backed up by your governing documents, like I said, naval regulations, Uniform Code of Military Justice. So these are the things that back up your authority. Now, there is a myth, like I mentioned, often you'll hear chiefs say, oh, our power's been taken away. We can't get things done. That's not really true. I think you need to go back and take time to review your responsibilities and understand the authorities you've been vested, right? And they're there everywhere. So let's cover a few of them. So let's talk about the authorities you have and the responsibilities. So planning, executing, and supervising of maintenance. Supervision of watch stations and as supervisors in watch standing, right? So operational excellence as well. You've got responsibilities and authorities to do that. So if you're a nuke and you're a watch supervisor, you have responsibilities and authorities to give orders and execute the successful operation of the nuke power plant. If you're a TAO, a chief that's qualified TAO, you have responsibilities and authorities that give you the ability to give the orders and be legitimized doing those things. You have responsibilities and authorities to train and educate your divisions. You have responsibilities and authorities to give rewards, right? And you can discipline your people as well with positive discipline, which is training and education, or negative discipline, which is where we get into punishment. But you do have a responsibility to do those things, and you have the authorities to fulfill those. So when you look at, and those are just a couple of things, I'm not going to go through them all, but when you sit down and think about all the things you're responsible for and that you have the authority to fulfill, any chief who sits there and tells me that they've lost their power, you're just telling me that you're abdicating your positional power. But you have the responsibility, you have the authorities to get done what you need to get done. And frankly, you have the backing of the chain of command and the chief's mess and governing regulations to get those things done, okay? The third A that we're going to get into is accountability. So you've been given responsibilities and authority to get those responsibilities done, but you are held accountable to fulfill those things. And often we talk about accountability and we think about external accountability, right? People think of accountability as, hey, people coming to me and holding me accountable, or when I don't do the things I need to do, I get held accountable. But accountability starts with self. So the biggest thing I'll say about accountability is taking ownership. So if you sit there, get into a new position of responsibility and authority, and you take time to review the position description and understand your scope of influence, what you're supposed to be doing, and who you've got working to do those things for you, you take accountability and ownership for all those things. So you own all the material spaces, material condition of the equipment you own. You own the training and education of your people to get those things done. You own the personal readiness of your people. If you just own those things, and frankly, you own the operational readiness, the watchstanding readiness and execution too. If you're doing those things and you're taking ownership, self-ownership for those things, you usually, with good intent to get things done in a good way, you'll find that very often you will rarely have to be held externally accountable. It's only the people that don't take ownership and personal accountability for the things that they own, everything that you're responsible for. Those are the ones that, what happens, you don't do the things you're supposed to do, you don't fulfill your responsibilities, you don't use your authorities to the full extent, and then people don't get things done what you need them to do. Things aren't executed to standards. And now the people above you or outside of you are going to come in. They're not just going to let that stuff happen. Now you're going to get held accountable. They're going to exert their power and influence on you and use their tools of influence to get you to do what you need to do. Okay, so in many cases, it's not that you've lost your power. It's you're not holding yourself accountable. And then there's some external accountability as well. I'll talk in a later chapter about CPO mess accountability. Yeah, the chief mess plays a huge role in accountability for personal and professional standards, right? So if I'm a chief petty officer and I'm not getting done what I need to get done, one of the first lines of external accountability should be a fellow chief petty officer, probably within my department or division, that pulls me aside and says, hey, you're not executing what you need to do from the outside. Your spaces aren't good, your sailors aren't trained, you're not meeting mission, you're not fulfilling the personal and professional expectations we have of chief petty officers. That's where that first line of external accountability goes up. And it can go up to more severe consequences, right? You don't ever want to get to the point to where you're called into NJP or even worse, a court martial. Those are high levels. We call them punishment, but they're high levels of accountability for you failing to take ownership and executing your duties and responsibilities. Okay. So that's a little bit of RAA. I'll take you, I encourage you again, sit there and really think about what are my responsibilities? What are my authorities? Am I really holding myself accountable and taking ownership of all the things I've got within my scope of influence as a chief petty officer to get done? I touch on it briefly, but in the petty officer's got to go more into depth on the concept of delegation as well. So to execute your responsibilities, there's a bunch of things you got to get done, and you just can't do them all by yourself. So you're going to have to delegate down things to people to get done for you. You never give up the responsibility. You can delegate some of the authority, right? These are fundamental relationships to get things done. But you've got to understand, this is where the situational leadership model comes in. So if you've ever read the situational leadership, that's good stuff. This is where this ties in. If you haven't, you need to pick up the situational leader and read it and understand situational leadership. But you really get into the maturity and willingness of the people that you want to delegate to. So you may have a person that's willing and eager to do and get things done for you, but they just don't have the experience, right? You've got to make sure when you delegate, you pick people that have the experience and they've got the character to get those things done for you, right? Often unsupervised, and they understand the responsibilities. So in the petty officer guide, I go more into depth of that. And when that comes out in the spring, you'll be able to read more. Didn't really go into it as a chief petty officer, but once again, take time to discuss with them your mess, this concept of delegating authority. And in many cases, if you've delegated and things aren't getting done, you're going to see that, right? You're going to miss timelines. You're not going to get things done to standard. The first thing you got to look at is yourself, right? And go, hey, did I fully communicate my standards? Did I delegate to the right people? Maybe I've got someone that's definitely willing and eager, but they just don't have the experience. Or maybe I've got someone I've delegated to with the experience and they just don't have the eagerness to get it done for you, right? They've lost that passion. So take a little time to reflect on delegation of authority, okay? And then finally, there's a discussion of always growing into your role. So, when you're a chief petty officer, newly selected, for those new chiefs out there, even though we took you through initiation process, that first year or so, you're growing into a new role, right? And I remember what it was like to first put on khakis and be addressed by a chief petty officer. It's different, right? In the relationships, you got to consider things like, hey, some of your peers may still be in your division or your unit. There's a new thing you got to get used to, right? How do you transition from peer to now supervisor? And some people struggle with that. So this is a time, if you're struggling with that, and you're a chief petty officer, go in the mess and have the conversation about, hey, I'm struggling with this. I need some tactics. I need some strategies to help me adjust. And maybe sometimes it's just a real conversation with those former peers of you, and a real demarcation of the lines between friendship and authority, frankly, in many cases. So that's pretty much sums it up for this chapter in your Chief Petty Officer's Guide, Chapter 3, Positional Power and History. Take some time to read it. At the end of the chapter, like all of them, there's some questions that guide you through some self-reflection. And I hope you find that useful. Okay, in the next one, we're going to get on to one of two powerful power bases. Okay, and recent theories say, hey, your two power bases, more than any others that we're going to discuss, really have an impact on the buy-in of your people. You can get a lot done with positional power, right? Because of your legitimate authorities, because of the authorities invested you in the chief petty officer in a military organization. You can go around all day and give orders and get people to get things done. The way you deliver those orders and the way you get those things done, hey, that can, people can respect that, right? You can survive and do well just relying on your positional authorities. Others kind of don't do so well there. But if you really want to take your organization to higher levels of commitment, you're going to have to learn to leverage your personal power and your expert power. So in the next episode of the series, we're going to start talking about your expert power. Talk about expert power, information power, and then we're going to talk a little bit about technical management skill. And I think I'm going to have to subdivide those into different videos because each of them is definitely got a lot of content to discuss about. So until next time, until the next episode, please join me again. Subscribe if you haven't gotten a copy of your Chief Petty Officer's Guide. That's with this compliments. You can find it on www.usni.org/press. It's also available online with booksellers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you can get books. You should be able to order a copy of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide online. So until next time, I want you to read, I want you to learn, I want you to reflect, and then I want you to take what you've learned and go out and make a positive difference. Good luck to you.